A city street falls silent after the rattle of gunfire. That moment in Chicago, on a cold February morning in 1929, changed everything. We are going back to the St. Valentines Day Massacre, a story where history and ghost stories bleed into one. By the end, you will understand not just what happened, but why this single act of violence echoes through time. We will meet the infamous gangsters who ruled with fear, walk through the unresolved crime scene, and listen to the whispers from those who say the 7 men killed that day never left. What does it take for a story to become a haunting? Chicago in the 1920s was a city of stark contradictions. Skyscrapers clawed at the sky, jazz poured from hidden clubs, and flappers danced in a whirl of sequins and rebellion. Yet beneath this glittering surface, a different kind of business was booming. It was a business born from a single, sweeping law: prohibition. The nationwide ban on alcohol did not stop people from wanting a drink. It simply handed the entire, incredibly lucrative trade over to criminals. Overnight, the city became a bootleg empire, and its streets transformed into a battleground for control. This was the tinderbox, dry on the surface but soaked in gasoline underneath, waiting for a single spark. 2 rival factions divided the city. From the south side, Al Capone built his empire. He was not just a gangster, he was a celebrity, a businessman in a tailored suit who operated with brutal efficiency. His organization supplied the speakeasies, the hidden bars behind unmarked doors, and he amassed a fortune while the police often looked the other way. His last major obstacle was the North Side Gang, led by the brash and volatile George Bugs Moran. Moran was everything Capone pretended not to be, openly flamboyant and quick to violence. Their feud was not just personal, it was territorial, a cold war over distribution routes, breweries, and the loyalty of every bartender in Chicago. The tension was a constant hum in the city's background noise. Drive-by shootings, bombings of rival breweries, and midnight kidnappings were part of the daily news. Capone, seeking to consolidate his power and eliminate his final rival, saw Moran as a problem that needed a permanent solution. He wanted to send a message so terrifying, so absolute, that no one would ever dare challenge his authority again. The stage was set not in a shadowy alley, but in a plain brick garage on North Clark Street, a building that would soon become the epicenter of American infamy. How do you plan the unthinkable, and what happens when violence is meant not just to kill but to echo forever? On the morning of February 14, 1929, Al Capone was 1,000 miles away. He was at his lavish Palm Island estate in Florida, enjoying the sunshine and entertaining guests. This was no coincidence, it was a calculated move. The distance provided him with the perfect, untouchable alibi. While his men carried out the grim task in a Chicago garage, Capone could plausibly claim he was merely a vacationing businessman, far removed from the city's violence. Yet every lawman and newspaper reader knew the truth in their gut. The sheer scale and brutality of the massacre had his fingerprints all over it. This was not a spontaneous clash, it was a military-style execution, and it required a general. The order, investigators believed, came from Florida, relayed through a chain of trusted lieutenants like Jack Machine Gun McGurn. Capone himself was a paradox that captivated the nation. To the public, he was a charismatic figure, a Robin Hood who handed out turkeys at Thanksgiving and opened soup kitchens. He wore expensive suits, gave charming interviews, and wanted desperately to be seen as a civic benefactor, a man of commerce rather than crime. But this carefully crafted image existed alongside a chilling ruthlessness. He understood that to rule his empire, he needed not just wealth, but a reputation for absolute, terrifying vengeance. The massacre was that reputation made flesh. It was a message written in bullets, intended to end the North Side Gang's challenge once and for all, and to warn anyone else who might consider crossing him. For years after, authorities tried desperately to build a legal bridge from that bloody garage floor in Chicago to the sunny porches of Palm Island. They interrogated his associates, offered deals to informants, and sifted through financial records, hoping to find the single piece of evidence that would tie the boss directly to the crime. But the wall of silence was impenetrable. The man who undoubtedly ordered the St. Valentines Day Massacre would never be charged for it. His alibi, however flimsy it seemed in the court of public opinion, held firm in a court of law. So if the mastermind escaped justice, who exactly faced the guns that morning? And what was it about that particular group of men that made them the target of such a devastating strike? The intended target of that brutal message was a man who lived by his own volatile code. George Bugs Moran was the polar opposite of Capone's calculated public persona. Where Capone wore silk, Moran preferred toughness, a street-smart brawler who had earned his nickname through a notoriously quick and unpredictable temper. He ruled the North Side with a clenched fist, and his frequent, brazen attempts to hijack Capone's liquor trucks or undercut his prices were more than business disputes. They were personal insults in an ongoing war. On that cold Thursday morning, Moran had called several of his key men to a seemingly ordinary location, the SMC Cottage Company garage at 2122 North Clark Street. To the outside world, it was a trucking business, but in reality, it served as a storage depot and distribution center for Moran's illicit alcohol. The plan, as best as anyone can reconstruct, was straightforward. Moran's men were to meet there to receive a shipment of hijacked whiskey, a routine transaction in their line of work. The 7 men who arrived were a mix of Moran's inner circle and associates, some with violent records, others who were simply mechanics or friends. They waited inside the garage main room, the air thick with the smell of motor oil and cold concrete, likely joking and smoking to pass the time. Unbeknownst to them, their routine had been meticulously observed. Moran himself was uncharacteristically late, a simple twist of fate that would rewrite history. As he and 2 associates approached the garage, they reportedly saw what they thought was a police car pulling up outside. Thinking it was a raid, they turned and discreetly fled to a nearby coffee shop. That decision, born from a lifetime of avoiding the law, spared George Bugs Moran from the very fate he had ordered for so many of his own rivals. Inside the garage, his men were not meeting police. They were facing a very different kind of authority. The stage was now set, not for a business deal, but for an act of violence so clinical and shocking it would freeze the nation. What did those men see in their final moments, and how could an execution be carried out with such chilling public boldness? The gray light of that February morning offered no warmth. Chicago was locked in a deep chill, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs, a typical winter day that held no hint of the extraordinary violence about to unfold. Inside the garage on North Clark Street, the 7 men waited, their breath visible in the unheated space, the routine boredom of their morning about to be shattered forever. At around 10:30, a black Cadillac sedan, the kind often used by detectives, pulled up to the curb. Witnesses on the street barely glanced its way. A police car was a common sight in that neighborhood. 2 men in police uniforms stepped out, followed by 2 more in sharp civilian overcoats and fedoras. To anyone watching, this looked like a standard police raid, a routine shakedown for bootleggers. The uniformed men entered the garage first, their authority unquestioned. They barked orders, telling Moran's men to line up and face the rear brick wall, to put their hands up for a search. The 7 men, likely annoyed but compliant, did as they were told. They turned their backs to the door, expecting to be frisked, perhaps arrested, but ultimately protected by the very rules of the law they so frequently broke. This was the cruel genius of the setup. In that moment of submission, they were utterly defenseless. Then, the 2 men in civilian clothes walked in. They were not carrying police batons or handcuffs. Each held a Thompson submachine gun, the infamous Tommy gun, a weapon that could fire hundreds of rounds a minute. What happened next was not a chaotic shootout. It was a methodical, horrifyingly quiet act of butchery. The men with the Tommy guns raised their weapons and opened fire on the line of backs before them. The roar of the guns inside the brick-walled garage was deafening, a staccato thunder that lasted for roughly 90 seconds. When the shooting stopped, a thick, acrid haze of gunpowder smoke hung in the air, mixing with the scent of blood and cement dust. The fake policeman and the two gunmen then walked calmly back out to the Cadillac, got in, and drove away at a normal speed, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable carnage. In under 2 minutes, the balance of power in Chicago had been permanently, violently shifted, but in their ruthless efficiency, the killers made one small, almost ghostly mistake. Against that cold brick wall stood 7 men, each with a name and a story now overshadowed by a single, violent event. They were not just faceless gangsters, they were individuals caught in a war they helped fuel. First were the Gusenberg brothers, Pete and Frank, both hardened enforcers for Moran. Pete was a known killer, feared even within his own circle, while Frank, though just as tough, was considered the slightly more level-headed of the two. Next was James Clark, Moran's brother-in-law and a trusted lieutenant, a direct link to the gang's leadership. Adam Heyer was the business brain, the bookkeeper who managed the gang's finances from a desk in that very garage. Then there was Albert Kashelek, who often used the alias James Morton, a safecracker and driver. Reinhard Schwimmer was the outlier, a young optometrist with no criminal record, drawn to the glamour and danger of the gangster life. He was simply a hanger-on, a friend who found the excitement irresistible. Finally, there was John May, the garage mechanic, a man whose only crime was being at work that day to service a truck. It is Frank Gusenberg's story that adds a haunting, human layer to the horror. Miraculously, he was still breathing when police arrived. Rushed to the hospital, he clung to life for nearly 3 hours. Detectives, knowing time was short, pleaded with him to name his attackers. "Who did this? Who shot you?" Frank Gusenberg, his body riddled with over 20 bullets, looked at them with fading eyes and uttered a line that would become legendary in gangland lore. He said, "Nobody shot me." In his final act, he upheld the brutal code of silence, the omerta, choosing loyalty to a dead cause over justice or revenge. His death sealed the fate of the investigation before it even began. These 7 men, from the ruthless enforcer to the star-struck optometrist, were collectively erased to send a message. But in focusing only on the message, we often forget the messengers, the complex, flawed individuals whose lives ended in a burst of Tommy gun fire. Their silence, whether forced by code or by death, created a vacuum, a mystery with no living witnesses. And into that void where facts end and imagination begins, something else began to stir. If the truth died with those men, what stories would the building itself begin to tell? The silence that followed the Cadillac's departure was a lie. Inside the garage, the reality was one of utter devastation. When the first real police officers arrived, summoned by concerned neighbors who finally dared to investigate the unnatural quiet, they were met with a scene of industrial-scale slaughter. The 7 men lay in twisted, bloody heaps against the wall, their bodies nearly torn apart by the close-range fire. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp, bitter odor of cordite. Scattered across the concrete floor were over 70 spent shell casings, most from .45 caliber Thompson submachine guns, but also a number of shotgun shells, suggesting the killers had used multiple weapons to ensure no one survived. The brick wall itself was pockmarked and stained, a grim canvas that told a story of sheer, overwhelming force. News of the massacre did not trickle out, it exploded. Within hours, newspaper reporters and photographers swarmed North Clark Street, pushing past police lines. The next day, front pages across the country were dominated by stark, shocking photographs of the blood-spattered garage interior. For a public accustomed to gangland shootings, this was different. This was not a dark alley ambush, but a cold, clinical execution staged like an official police raid. The brazenness, the sheer number of victims, and the grotesque imagery shattered any remaining romantic notions about the gangster lifestyle. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was no longer just a Chicago crime, it was a national scandal. This public outrage created a seismic shift. Ordinary citizens who had often viewed bootleggers as necessary evils providing a desired service now saw the brutal cost of that convenience. The pressure on law enforcement became immense and unrelenting. The message from Washington and from newspaper editorials was clear: the era of tolerance was over. This pressure fell heavily on a man named J. Edgar Hoover, the ambitious director of the relatively young Federal Bureau of Investigation. While his agents had no jurisdiction over a local murder, the massacre provided the perfect catalyst. Hoover understood that to win public trust and expand his bureau's power, he needed a monumental victory. He needed to take down the man everyone believed was responsible, Al Capone. Since the Chicago police could not pierce the wall of silence, Hoover and other federal authorities pursued a different path. If they could not convict Capone for murder, they would nail him for something else, anything else. Their relentless focus turned to his finances, to the millions of dollars he earned but never reported to the government. The bloody ghosts of that garage would ultimately lead the law to Capone's door, not with a murder charge but with a tax bill. Yet, as the legal wheels began to turn, a strange thing happened to the physical scene of the crime itself. The building on North Clark Street, emptied of bodies and evidence, did not simply return to being just a garage. It began to develop a reputation of its own, one not based on facts but on feelings, on chills in the air, and on stories that defied all logic. The investigation into the massacre hit a wall of silence before it even began. In the world of organized crime, the Code of Omerta was not just a suggestion, it was a matter of life and death. To speak to the police was the ultimate betrayal, a sin punishable not only by your own death, but potentially by the deaths of your entire family. With Frank Gusenberg's final refusal to talk, the most crucial eyewitnesses were all dead or utterly unwilling. This left the Chicago police, led by the determined and famously incorruptible Captain John Steege, chasing shadows. He and every detective on the force knew with absolute certainty that Al Capone had ordered the hit. Proving it in a court of law, however, was an entirely different matter. The killers had been too careful, too professional. The few physical clues they left behind led nowhere. The black Cadillac used in the crime was found abandoned days later, but it was a stolen vehicle, its ownership trail cold. Ballistics experts matched the shotgun shells at the scene to weapons that were likely purchased from a hardware store in the suburb of River Forest, a store that conveniently had no record of the sale. Every potential lead dissolved into nothing. Captain Steege's frustration was palpable and public. He was a man who prided himself on cleaning up his city, yet he was powerless to touch the architect of its most infamous crime. The massacre was like a perfect, ghostly handprint, visible to everyone but impossible to lift any evidence from. Without witnesses, the police were left with theories, and the most persistent one pointed to Capone's most trusted and violent lieutenant. Jack Machine Gun McGurn was widely suspected of planning and leading the execution squad. He had the motive, a deep personal hatred for Bugs Moran, and he had the ruthless skill to carry it out. The two men in police uniforms, it was speculated, could have been genuine corrupt officers or simply gangsters in convincing disguise, there to lend an air of authority and ensure compliance from the victims. Yet despite intense scrutiny, alibis were produced, witnesses were intimidated, and McGurn, like his boss, was never charged. The St. Valentines Day Massacre was solved in the court of public opinion, but it remains to this day officially unsolved. The justice system, built on evidence and testimony, had been completely outmaneuvered by a criminal code more powerful than any law. If the police could not find justice, who would? The answer, surprisingly, would come from an entirely different branch of the government, one that was not looking for bloodstains or shell casings, but for something far more mundane and for Al Capone far more dangerous. While the police hit a wall, the whispers on the street named names. The prime suspect was a man whose very nickname was a weapon. Jack Machine Gun McGurn, born Vincenzo Gibaldi, was Al Capone's most feared enforcer. He was young, handsome, ruthlessly efficient, and he harbored a personal vendetta against Bugs Moran. Years earlier, Moran's men had brutally attacked McGurn, leaving him for dead. Survival only deepened his commitment to revenge, making him the perfect candidate to lead the massacre's execution squad. Yet, when questioned, McGurn presented a seemingly ironclad alibi. He claimed he had spent the entire morning of February 14th in a hotel room with his girlfriend, a showgirl named Louise Rolfe, who corroborated his story without hesitation. To the frustration of investigators, this alibi, however convenient, could not be broken. It was a classic gangland tactic, using romance as a shield for murder. But McGurn was never believed to have acted alone. The two men in civilian clothes, the ones who actually fired the Tommy guns, were likely drawn from a small pool of Capone's most trusted and psychopathic marksmen. Names like Fred Killer Burke, a known associate and expert driver, and the duo of John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, both seasoned killers, frequently surfaced in police theories. These men were professionals of violence, the kind who viewed the massacre not as a personal act, but as a job to be completed with chilling detachment. An even more disturbing theory suggests the two men dressed as police officers were not gangsters in costume at all, but actual corrupt Chicago policemen. This possibility added a layer of profound horror to the event, implying the law itself had been weaponized to carry out the murder. It was a notion that, if true, explained the victim's immediate compliance and the killer's flawless escape, but it was a thread too dangerous for any official investigation to ever pull. The fates of these suspected men read like a grim epilogue written by the very violence they served. Albert Anselmi and John Scalise, after a perceived betrayal, were allegedly bludgeoned to death by Capone himself at a banquet, a brutal lesson in loyalty. Fred Burke was eventually captured for an unrelated murder and died in prison, and Jack Machine Gun McGurn, the man who danced around justice for the massacre, did not find a peaceful end. On the eve of Valentine's Day, 7 years after the garage killings, he was gunned down in a bowling alley, his body riddled with bullets. His murder was never solved. This cycle of violence, where the hunters became the hunted, created a strange form of street-level justice, while no one was ever convicted for the scent. Valentine's Day Massacre, many of its likely architects met equally bloody ends. This lack of a courtroom verdict, this failure to ever officially solve the crime, is what cemented its legend. It became the so-called perfect gangland crime, not because it was without clues, but because it was carried out with such operational precision and protected by such absolute silence that the legal system was rendered powerless. The truth was buried with the suspects, leaving behind only the echo of gunfire and a lingering question. If the men are gone and the case is closed, why does the story feel so unsettlingly alive? The building at 2122 North Clark Street could not escape its own story. After the bodies were removed and the police tape came down, the SMC Cottage Company garage did not simply fade back into the city's anonymous brickwork. Instead, it transformed into something else entirely, a macabre landmark. The infamy of the St Valentines Day Massacre drew a steady, grim pilgrimage. Tourists, curiosity seekers, and even reporters would stand outside, peering at the unremarkable facade, trying to glimpse the horror within. But for some, looking was not enough. They wanted a piece of it. Visitors began chipping away at the interior brick wall, the very wall the victims had faced, pocketing fragments as morbid souvenirs. Each missing chunk was a silent testament to the public's gruesome fascination, a physical erosion of the crime scene itself. For decades, the garage passed through various owners and was used as a storage facility, but its primary identity was always that of the massacre site. The owner in the 1960s, tired of the constant gawkers and the dark legacy cemented into the mortar, made a decisive choice. In 1967, he had the entire structure demolished. He wanted to erase the attraction and perhaps lay a ghost to rest, yet erasure is never complete. In a twist that perfectly captures our inability to let go of history, sections of that infamous brick wall were carefully salvaged before the wrecking ball swung. One large segment found a new home in a Canadian museum dedicated to crime. Smaller pieces were sold off, circulating in the shadowy collector's market, turning evidence of a massacre into fragmented commodities. Today, if you visit the address, you will not find a garage. You will find a quiet, paved parking lot serving a nursing home. It is an ordinary space for ordinary days. But for many who know the history, that emptiness is charged. The ground itself seems to remember. Visitors and paranormal enthusiasts report feeling sudden, unexplained chills on warm days, hearing the faint echo of distant engines or muffled voices, or experiencing a profound, unsettling sense of being watched from a void where a wall once stood. The building is gone, but the memory, and some insist the energy, of what happened there is permanently etched into the lot, a silent, haunted scar on Chicago's landscape. This lingering presence begs a deeper question. If a place can hold such a powerful echo long after the physical structure is gone, what does that say about the event that created it? And more importantly, who or what might be doing the echoing? The nursing home built over that empty lot is a place of quiet care, but its foundation rests on a memory of chaos. For decades, those who work or visit there have reported experiences that defy easy explanation, stories that stitch the past directly into the present. Nurses working the late shift have spoken of hearing the sudden, sharp sound of screeching tires from the parking lot, a noise that sends them to the windows only to find the asphalt silent and empty. Others, especially in the cold, still hours around dawn on February 14th, claim to hear muffled pops that sound nothing like backfires, a staccato rhythm that echoes and then fades into nothing. There are whispers of distant, anguished cries that seem to come from the walls themselves, brief and chilling before the ordinary sounds of the building return. The sensations described are not just auditory. Visitors and staff alike have reported walking through certain areas of the building or the adjacent parking lot and being hit by a wave of inexplicable, bone-deep dread, a feeling of being watched by something unseen and hostile. This is often accompanied by a physical chill, a pocket of freezing air in an otherwise warm corridor, a phenomenon paranormal researchers often call a cold spot. The most persistent and vivid account, however, involves a sighting that directly mirrors the historical record. Multiple independent witnesses over the years have reported seeing a sleek, black vintage car, often described as a Cadillac, slowly cruising past the nursing home or idling in the parking lot. When they look again, or when they approach, the vehicle has simply vanished, leaving no trace and no sound. These are not the stories of people looking for ghosts. They are the unsettled reports of nurses ending their shifts, of construction workers doing repairs, of ordinary people going about their day who encountered something they could not explain. Their testimonies, given separately over many years, weave a consistent tapestry of residual energy, as if the trauma of that morning was recorded into the very fabric of the location, replaying on a loop when the conditions are right. If these echoes are real, what are they trying to say, and could they be connected to something more than just a memory trapped in stone and asphalt? The most chilling stories are not about the building, but about the men who never left it. Visitors and staff near the old garage site, now the nursing home parking lot, often report seeing shadowy, indistinct figures. These aren't clear faces or forms, but rather dark silhouettes that seem to stand in a rough line against a wall that no longer exists. The number is what stops people cold. Witnesses consistently count 7 of them. They appear in the gray light of dawn or in the deep shadows of evening, holding their formation for a few heartbeats before dissolving into the night air. It's as if the final, terrible moment of their lives has been seared into the location, a ghostly photograph redeveloping itself when the world is quiet enough. More specific apparitions have also been named. The most commonly seen is a man in period clothing, a heavy overcoat and fedora from the 1920s. He is often described as moving slowly, with a pained or deeply confused expression, wandering the edges of the parking lot as if searching for something he can't find. Paranormal researchers and local historians have long associated this figure with Frank Gusenberg, the enforcer who survived long enough to speak but chose silence. His ghost, they suggest, is forever trapped in that moment of agonizing decision, replaying his final, loyal lie. Other sensory echoes haunt the space. People have reported sudden, sharp scents that have no earthly source in a parking lot, the acrid, sulfurous smell of gunpowder that arrives and vanishes in an instant. Worse is the occasional metallic tang of blood, a coppery odor that fills the air and triggers a primal sense of dread. Auditory phenomena complete the haunting. Beyond the distant gunshots, some have claimed to hear faint, muffled voices. They are not conversations but fragmented pleas, whispers that sound like no or don't, or the soft, desperate sound of weeping. These experiences, reported independently by people with no stake in ghost stories, create a compelling, tragic narrative. The seven shadows are the collective tragedy, the scent of cordite is the violent action, and the lone, wandering figure of Gusenberg is the human consequence, a soul bound by a code that outlasted his own life. This suggests the haunting is not one of anger or malice, but of profound disorientation and unresolved trauma. If these echoes are real, they are not trying to frighten us, they are simply lost, forever replaying the morning their world ended in thunder and smoke. But why would such a powerful imprint remain in a place where the walls themselves are gone? The answer may lie not in brick and mortar, but in the nature of violence itself and what it leaves behind in the very air we breathe. The stories from the nursing home residents are perhaps the most unsettling of all. These are not thrill seekers or ghost hunters, but elderly men and women living out their final years in a place meant for peace and care. Yet, some have reported nighttime visits that defy all rational explanation. They speak of waking to find young men in old-fashioned suits, their hair slicked back, standing silently at the foot of their beds. The figures do not speak or move threateningly. They simply observe with a solemn, almost sorrowful air before fading from view as silently as they appeared. For residents with fading memories, these encounters are often recounted with a clarity that surprises their families and caregivers, described not as dreams but as real waking events. The staff, too, have their own catalogue of unexplained disturbances. Nurses making their rounds in the deep quiet of the night shift have heard the distinct sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing down empty hallways, footsteps that stop abruptly when they turn a corner to find no one there. More commonly, they encounter small, perplexing anomalies, objects that defy logic. A chair will be found pulled out from a desk in a room that has been locked for hours. A framed photograph, securely placed on a shelf, will be discovered face down on the floor without a sound. One nurse reported consistently finding the faucet in a patient's bathroom turned onto a slow, steady drip, despite turning it off firmly each time she left the room. These are not grand, poltergeist-like events, but subtle, persistent intrusions, as if a residual energy from the past is gently testing the boundaries of the present. What makes these accounts so compelling is their source. These are trained medical professionals and vulnerable seniors, people not given to flights of fancy. Their experiences suggest the violence that soaked into that ground did not dissipate with the demolition of the garage. Instead, it seems to have seeped upward, permeating the foundation of the building that now stands there. The energy of that traumatic morning, the fear, the confusion, and the sudden severing of 7 lives, may act like a psychic stain, disturbing the atmosphere for anyone sensitive enough to perceive it. It connects the past to the present in the most intimate way possible, not through history books, but through the whispered confusions of the elderly and the weary observations of those who care for them. If the land itself remembers, what does it want us to know? These persistent whispers from the past have not gone unnoticed by those armed with modern tools. In recent decades, the quiet parking lot and the nursing home grounds have become a destination for paranormal investigation teams, groups who approach the mystery not with folklore but with technology. They come with digital recorders, night vision cameras, and electromagnetic field meters, seeking to document what so many have felt. Their goal is to capture concrete evidence, a voice from the void or a flicker of energy that defies rational explanation. This scientific angle transforms the ghost hunt into a historical probe, using 21st century devices to interrogate a 20th century crime scene. One of the most compelling and chilling forms of evidence they pursue is known as electronic voice phenomena, or EVP. Investigators will leave digital recorders running in the silence of the parking lot, asking questions into the empty air. When they review the audio later, they sometimes find clear, intelligent responses that were not heard at the time. On recordings from the site, voices have been captured whispering phrases like "help us" and "get down." One particularly stark EVP seems to count in a rushed, panicked tone: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, a chilling echo of the final tally from that morning. These disembodied whispers, often clear and distinct against the background noise, suggest an attempt at communication from something that remains. Visual anomalies add another layer to the puzzle. Photographs taken at the location, even on clear nights, sometimes reveal strange, unexplained mists that seem to hover just above the asphalt, with no source of fog or breath in the air. Others capture clusters of luminous orbs, balls of light that drift through the frame. Skeptics often dismiss these as dust particles or lens flares, but investigators note their frequency and specific location, arguing they appear with a consistency that demands a second look. Then there are the electromagnetic field meters, or EMF readers. These devices measure fluctuations in ambient electromagnetic energy, which paranormal researchers theorize can be disturbed by spiritual presence. At the massacre site, investigators have documented sudden, powerful spikes on their EMF meters in the middle of the open parking lot, far from any electrical wiring, fuse boxes, or modern appliances. The needles jump and the devices emit high-pitched alerts, indicating a strong, localized energy field with no logical source. To the investigators, this is not just a ghost story, it is data. A whisper on a digital file, an orb in a photograph, a spike on a meter, these are the puzzle pieces they collect, attempting to build a case for residual energy. It presents a fascinating intersection where technology meets tradition, where the desire for proof confronts an event that officially offers none. If these recordings and readings are genuine, what are they ultimately revealing? Is it the trauma of the victims, forever imprinted on the environment, or could it be something else, a warning from history that we have yet to fully understand? The persistent chill in that parking lot is more than just a ghost story, it is a psychological puzzle. To understand why this particular event clings so fiercely to our imagination, we must look beyond the supernatural and into the very nature of trauma itself. One compelling explanation lies in the concept of a residual haunting. Imagine a moment of extreme violence saturated with terror, pain, and shock as a powerful emotional lightning strike. Some theories suggest such an intense burst of human energy can, in a sense, become imprinted upon the physical environment, like a psychic recording on a loop. This is not a conscious ghost with a personality, but rather a replay of the event itself, a fragment of time trapped in amber. The phantom gunshots, the 7 shadows against the wall, the scent of cordite, these could be echoes of that violent imprint, replaying when the conditions are right, much like a stone retains heat long after the sun has set. It is a place remembering its own worst moment over and over. Adding profound weight to this echo is a stark human truth: there was no justice. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre remains officially unsolved. Not a single person was ever convicted for those 7 murders, while Al Capone went to prison for tax evasion, and many suspects met violent ends. The courtroom verdict for this specific crime was never delivered. In the human psyche, a lack of closure is a powerful force. We have an innate need for balance, for wrongs to be righted. When that need is thwarted on such a grand and public scale, a narrative vacuum forms. The story feels unfinished, the energy of the crime unresolved. This collective sense of injustice can fuel the belief that the victims themselves remain unsettled, that their spirits cannot rest because the world never officially acknowledged the wrong done to them. The haunting, then, becomes a metaphor for our own unresolved feelings about the event. Finally, we must consider the power of place and collective memory. Chicago is a city built on stories, and the massacre was a foundational trauma in its modern mythology. It was not a private tragedy, but a public spectacle splashed across every newspaper in the nation. The entire city, and indeed the country, shared in the shock and horror. When a community collectively remembers and retells a story of such magnitude, that story takes on a life of its own. It seeps into the identity of the location. The parking lot is not just a piece of land, it is a symbol. Every time someone feels a chill there or recounts a strange experience, they are participating in that collective memory, adding another layer to the legend. The ghost stories become the language through which we process a historical trauma that feels too large, too brutal, and too unfinished to be contained by the history books alone. We are not just hearing ghosts, we are listening to the echo of a city's conscience. Justice, when denied in a courtroom, often finds its own twisted path in the streets. The brutal calculus of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre seemed to set off a chain reaction, a grim domino effect that toppled every major player involved. It began with the intended target himself. George Bugs Moran survived the morning, but his empire did not. The massacre shattered his North Side gang, scattering his terrified men and obliterating his ability to operate. Stripped of his power and wealth, Moran faded into a pathetic shadow of his former self. Decades later, a broken and desperate man, he was arrested for a small time bank robbery, a humiliating end for a once feared kingpin. He died of lung cancer in Leavenworth Penitentiary, a forgotten inmate, his name just a footnote in the prison ledger. The men suspected of carrying out Capone's orders fared no better. As we heard, Jack Machine Gun McGurn was gunned down in a bowling alley on a Valentine's Day Eve. The duo of Albert Anselmi and John Scalise were allegedly betrayed and murdered by their own boss. Fred Killer Burke died behind bars. Each met an end as violent as the one they helped orchestrate, a pattern too consistent to ignore. Then there was Al Capone himself. His victory was spectacular but hollow. The massacre made him the undisputed crime lord of Chicago, but it also made him the most wanted man in America. The public outrage fueled a federal crusade, and the Treasury Department found his weakness. In 1931, Al Capone, the man who ordered 7 murders, was convicted not for any violent crime but for failing to pay his taxes. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, eventually landing in the newly opened fortress of Alcatraz. His physical and mental health crumbled there, ravaged by the late stages of syphilis. The shrewd, commanding boss deteriorated into a confused, childlike shell of a man, paroled in 1939 to live out his final years in seclusion and incapacity. He died in 1947, not in a blaze of gunfire but quietly in his Florida mansion. So we look at this grim ledger: Moran dying poor in prison, Capone's mind destroyed in prison, his gunmen murdered in the streets. It begs a haunting question: was this merely the predictable fallout of a violent lifestyle, or did the brutality of that single Valentine's Day act like a curse, a karmic poison that seeped into the lives of all who touched it? Perhaps the ghosts of Clark Street did not need to seek vengeance because the violence they spawned carried its own inevitable decay. But the echoes of that February morning are not confined to a single parking lot. The story of the St. Valentines Day Massacre is woven into a larger tapestry of hauntings, all connected to the man who cast the longest shadow, Al Capone himself. His ghost, or at least the memory of his overwhelming presence, is said to linger in the very spaces he once commanded. Take the Lexington Hotel on South Michigan Avenue. For years, this was Capone's unofficial headquarters, the nerve center of his empire. Today, the building stands renovated into condominiums, but residents and workers have long told stories of unexplained phenomena. The sound of phantom typewriters clicks from empty rooms, echoing the busy accounting of illicit fortunes. Heavy, masculine footsteps are heard pacing the halls late at night, a rhythm of restless authority. Some have even reported catching the distinct, sweet aroma of cigar smoke, Capone's preferred vice, wafting through sealed apartments, a sensory ghost that defies all logic. It is as if the ambition and anxiety that filled the building during his reign left a permanent stain on the atmosphere. Then there is the Green Mill Cocktail Lounge in Uptown. This legendary jazz club was, in Capone's day, one of his favorite speakeasies. He kept a permanent, guarded booth in the back where he could watch both the stage and the door. Modern patrons who sit in that same booth, now open to the public, often describe a sudden, palpable shift in the air. They feel an intense, watchful pressure, as if someone is standing right behind them though the space is empty. Others report unexplained chills and a sense of being scrutinized, a lingering energy of paranoia and control from the man who demanded to see everything. Even Capone's final refuge, his Palm Island estate in Florida, is not free from whispers. While privately owned and rarely accessed, stories persist from past staff and neighbors of shadowy figures seen on the grounds and lights flickering in the vacant mansion long after it was emptied, suggesting a spirit unable to relax even in the sunny retreat he built with tainted wealth. These scattered hauntings, from a Chicago hotel to a Florida villa, create a fascinating pattern. They suggest that a legacy of violence and unchecked power does not simply vanish. It can seep into the bricks of a headquarters, the fabric of a nightclub booth, the very soil of an estate. The ghost stories surrounding Al Capone are rarely tales of a penitent soul. They are stories of a man still in command, still watching, still occupying his territories. This expands the haunting of the massacre beyond the victims to the architect himself. It paints a picture of a man so defined by his dominion that even death could not fully sever his connection to the places he ruled. If his spirit is indeed restless, what is it searching for? An empire lost, or perhaps something far less tangible? A story that powerful could never be confined to history books alone. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre bled almost instantly from the front pages into the very fabric of our popular culture, becoming a defining symbol of an era. Hollywood, in particular, seized upon its stark, cinematic horror. In 1967, director Roger Corman released the bluntly titled film, The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. While not a blockbuster, its ensemble cast and gritty, docudrama style cemented the visual language of the event for a generation, from the black Cadillac to the final, brutal execution against the brick wall. But perhaps the most ingenious use of the massacre came earlier, in a film that was not a gangster movie at all. Billy Wilder's classic comedy Some Like It Hot from 1959 opens with a brilliant, darkly funny parody. We see a hearse pull up to a garage, men in police uniforms get out, and a moment later, the rattle of machine gun fire sends a funeral wreath tumbling to the street. In under 2 minutes, the film establishes its dangerous, farcical world, relying on the audience's immediate recognition of the infamous event. This showed just how deeply the massacre had penetrated the national psyche. It was now a shared reference point, a shorthand for Prohibition-era chaos. This constant retelling in films, television shows, and pulp novels did something crucial. It transformed raw history into polished legend. With each dramatization, details were amplified, motives were simplified, and characters became archetypes. Al Capone evolved from a complex criminal businessman into the quintessential gangster kingpin. The 7 victims were often homogenized into a single tragic unit. The garage on North Clark Street became less a real place and more a universal set piece for American violence. This process of myth-making has a direct and often overlooked connection to the ghost stories. When we consume so many dramatic versions of an event, our perception of its emotional weight becomes magnified. We are not just remembering the historical facts, we are absorbing decades of artistic interpretation, each layer adding to the collective energy surrounding the story. The paranormal experiences reported at the site, the chills and the whispers, may draw power not only from the trauma of the event itself, but from the immense cultural shadow it has cast for nearly a century. We have, in a sense, been haunting this story ourselves, retelling it so often that we have charged the very memory with a potent, lingering presence. So where does the historical truth end and the legend begin? And in a place where the two are so thoroughly intertwined, how could anything ever truly rest? The official story is a frame, but the picture inside remains maddeningly blurred. Decades of investigation have left us not with answers, but with a collection of compelling, conflicting theories that keep the mystery alive. The identity of the 2 civilian triggermen is perhaps the most persistent gap. Were they imported out-of-town talent like the suspected Fred Killer Burke, brought in specifically for the job to leave no local ties? Or were they Chicago men, trusted killers from Capone's own inner circle, whose faces were too well known to risk recognition? Without a single reliable eyewitness, their names are lost to the alleyways of history, leaving only the echo of their Tommy guns. An even more disturbing question hangs over the 2 men in police uniforms. The prevailing theory is they were gangsters in convincing costume, their disguises a cruel trick to ensure compliance. But a darker, more plausible alternative persists, that they were actual Chicago policemen on Capone's payroll. This would explain why Moran's hardened men, always wary of an ambush, so readily turned their backs. It would mean the law itself walked in and lined them up for slaughter, a betrayal so profound it chills the blood even today. Then there is the puzzle of the setup itself. How did the killers know Moran's men would be in that garage at that exact time? This points almost certainly to an inside informant, someone within Moran's crumbling organization. A disgruntled driver, a jealous lieutenant, or a man simply bought with Capone's cash could have provided the perfect intelligence, turning a routine meeting into a death trap. The most tragic theory of all suggests the massacre was a catastrophic error. Some historians have floated the idea that the hit was intended to be a kidnapping, a move to forcibly bring Moran to Capone for a negotiation or a humiliation. The excessive firepower in this scenario was a panicked overreaction when the victims, thinking it was a real police raid, may have resisted. An even grimmer version proposes a case of mistaken identity, that the killers believed Bugs Moran himself was inside. When they realized he was not among the 7, they simply carried out the executions anyway to leave no witnesses to their failed primary objective. These theories are not wild speculation, they are attempts to fill the void left by a failed investigation and an unbreakable code of silence. Each unanswered question is a crack in the official narrative, and into those cracks imagination seeps. This is where history bleeds into legend. The lack of closure, the missing faces, the unknown motives, these are the very ingredients that allow ghost stories to take root and flourish. When facts end, the stories begin, not to replace history but to haunt its empty spaces. If we can never know for certain who pulled the triggers or why, is it any wonder that some believe the victims themselves are still trying to tell us? The bricks that absorbed the gunfire were never destined to be forgotten. After the garage was demolished in 1967, the most infamous section of that blood-stained wall did not go to a landfill. Instead, it began a bizarre cross-continental journey, transforming from a crime scene into a fragmented, macabre collectible. The largest surviving portion, a massive segment measuring over 10 feet wide, was purchased by a Canadian businessman. His plan was as strange as it was ironic. He initially installed the bricks as a backdrop in the men's restroom of a Vancouver nightclub called the Banjo Palace. For years, patrons could literally relieve themselves against a piece of American gangland history, a darkly humorous fate for a wall that witnessed such horror. Later, the wall found a more dignified, if no less peculiar, home in a private museum in Niagara Falls, Canada, before its current residence at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. There, it stands as a centerpiece exhibit, solemnly lit and presented with the gravity it was always denied in a bathroom. Smaller fragments were chiseled away by souvenir hunters over the decades, ending up in private collections, sometimes sold online as haunted artifacts or macabre curios. The journey of this wall is a story of its own, reflecting our uncomfortable fascination with violence. We preserve battlefields and memorialize tragedy, yet here we have a literal wall from a massacre, broken into pieces and traded like sacred relics of a secular crime. This raises a compelling, almost supernatural question. If a place can be haunted by the energy of a traumatic event, what happens when you remove a physical piece of that place? Could a brick soaked in that moment's terror carry a fragment of the echo with it? It is a concept found in folklore, the idea that an object can be imprinted with spiritual residue, a touchstone for the past. The reports from the nursing home parking lot suggest the primary energy remains at the source, a stain on the land itself. But what of those scattered bricks? Do they act as tiny anchors, holding a sliver of that February morning in suspended animation, waiting for a sensitive person to brush against their cold, rough surface and feel a ghost of the past? The wall's odd pilgrimage from a Chicago garage to a Las Vegas museum gives the legend a tangible, quirky spine. We can no longer visit the original site, but we can stand before its bones and wonder if some whispers are trapped in the mortar. The wall's journey from a crime scene to a museum piece leaves us with a haunting hypothetical. What if the St Valentines Day Massacre happened today? Modern forensic science would transform that garage from a silent tomb into a chorus of evidence. The first officers on the scene would not just see blood and shell casings, they would see a treasure trove of biological and physical clues, each with a story to tell. The killers, for all their planning, would have left behind an invisible trail we can now follow. Imagine the trace evidence alone. In 1929, a fiber from a coat or a hair caught on a splintered door frame was nearly impossible to link to a suspect. Today, advanced DNA analysis could extract a genetic profile from the sweat on a steering wheel, the skin cells under a victim's fingernails, or even the saliva on a discarded cigarette butt left outside. That single profile could be run through a national database, potentially identifying a suspect or a close relative within hours. The killer's meticulous disguise would work against them. The fake police uniforms, likely rented or specially made, would shed unique fibers everywhere. Modern spectroscopy could match those fibers not just to a type of cloth, but to a specific manufacturer's batch, tracing them back to a supplier. The Tommy guns and shotguns left behind over 70 shell casings. In the 1920s, ballistics could link a bullet to a specific gun if the weapon was recovered. Today's integrated ballistic identification systems can digitally compare the unique markings on those casings to a nationwide database of firearms used in other crimes, possibly revealing a pattern or a signature weapon long before the murderers left the state. The black Cadillac would be a gold mine. Instead of a stolen vehicle with a cold trail, it would be processed as a major piece of evidence. Latent fingerprint powders and chemical fuming would reveal prints on the door handles, the gear shift, and the dashboard. Those prints would be scanned and cross-referenced against millions in digital databases. Trace evidence from the floor mats, soil on the tires, and even pollen in the air vents could geolocate where the car had been before the crime, mapping the killer's movements. Perhaps most damning of all would be the digital footprint that simply did not exist in 1929. The planners would have communicated. Phone records, even from burner phones, create a map of connections through cell tower pings. Surveillance cameras on nearby businesses, traffic lights, or even a doorbell camera from a neighboring home would have captured the Cadillac's approach, the men exiting, and their escape. In a world of constant digital observation, anonymity is a relic of the past. This stark contrast underscores why the case remains so profoundly unsolvable. The Chicago police of 1929 did not fail because they were incompetent. They failed because the tools they needed did not yet exist. Crucial evidence was lost because no one knew to look for it. Blood was just blood, not a unique DNA signature. A fiber was just dirt. The car was just a stolen vehicle. Every piece of the puzzle was there, but the technology to read the clues was still a lifetime away. This investigative void is not just a historical footnote, it is the very bedrock of the haunting. When science provides no answers, when logic hits a dead end, the human mind seeks explanation elsewhere. The persistent chill in that parking lot, the whispers on the wind, they fill the silence left by absent evidence. They are the echo of questions that forensics in its time could never ask. This pattern of lingering echoes is not unique to a Chicago parking lot. Across the world, places scarred by sudden, mass violence often develop similar reputations. The Tower of London, for centuries a site of imprisonment and execution, is famously haunted by figures like Anne Boleyn, who is said to wander the grounds carrying her own head, a ghostly testament to a traumatic and public death. The battlefield of Gettysburg, where tens of thousands perished in a matter of days, is renowned for countless sightings of spectral soldiers, heard cries, and the persistent feeling of being watched from the woods and fields. These locations, like Clark Street, share three powerful ingredients. First is the shock of sudden, untimely death, a life cut short without warning or preparation. Second is the frequent lack of proper burial rites or memorialization. At Gettysburg, many soldiers were buried hastily in mass graves, and in the Tower, traitors were denied Christian burial. This disruption of sacred tradition is thought to leave spirits in a state of confusion, unable to move on. Finally, there is the element of public trauma, where the violence was witnessed by a community or an entire nation, embedding the event into collective memory with extraordinary force. The St Valentines Day Massacre fits this framework perfectly. 7 men died without a moment's notice, their bodies left in a pool of blood on a garage floor, a scene witnessed only by the nation through grim newspaper photos. They were gangsters denied the dignity of public mourning. Their story became a shared cultural wound. When we hear the ghost stories from that nursing home parking lot, we are not just hearing about Chicago. We are listening to a universal human response to historical horror. Ghost lore becomes the language we use to process what is too brutal, too unresolved for history books alone. It is our way of saying the past is not truly past, especially when justice was never served. So the question shifts. It is no longer just about whether the Clark Street ghosts are real, but about why we need them to be. What does this enduring need to haunt our most violent spaces reveal about us, and about the stories we cannot bear to let go? But for every story of a shadowy figure, there is a scientist with a clipboard and a perfectly logical explanation. The human mind is a powerful storyteller, especially in a place where it knows a terrible story already occurred. This is the power of suggestion at work. When you stand in that parking lot fully aware of its history, every creak of a nursing home window, every distant siren, every shift in the wind is filtered through that knowledge. Your brain, primed for mystery, connects these ordinary dots into an extraordinary picture. It is not a ghost you are sensing, but the echo of your own expectation. Then there is the science of sound itself. Researchers have discovered that very low-frequency sound waves, known as infrasound, are inaudible to the human ear but can have profound physical effects. These waves, which can be produced by heavy machinery, distant traffic, or even wind passing through certain structures, can cause feelings of intense unease, anxiety, and even the sensation of being watched. They can make your eyeballs vibrate, creating the illusion of seeing movement in your peripheral vision. Could the strange chills and dread reported at the site simply be the body's subconscious reaction to an unseen, inaudible hum from the city around it? A historian specializing in Chicago folklore might gently point out that ghost stories are not evidence of spirits, but evidence of a culture processing its past. We build legends around our most traumatic events as a way to contain them, to give a face and a form to abstract horror. The tale of the Seven Shadows and the Wandering Gunman becomes a modern myth, a campfire story for an urban setting, passed down not to report facts but to reinforce the moral and emotional weight of the history. It is a form of collective memory far more powerful than any police report. And what of the voices on the recordings, the electronic voice phenomena? Audio pareidolia is a well-documented phenomenon where our brains, desperate to find patterns in random noise, assemble words from static, from the hum of a refrigerator, or from the muffled sounds of a city at night. We hear our own language in the chaos because we are wired to seek meaning. Given the emotional charge of the location, it is almost inevitable that a sensitive listener reviewing hours of blank audio might find a whispered phrase that fits the narrative they already hold in their mind. These rational perspectives are not meant to dismiss the experiences people report, but to frame them. They remind us that the landscape of the paranormal is often shaped by the geography of the human brain. Yet this careful debunking leads us to the most compelling question of all. If all these experiences can be explained away by suggestion, sound waves, and folklore, why do the stories not only persist but do so with such consistency across decades? Why do so many people, unaware of the history, report the same specific sensations before they ever learn what happened there? The rational explanations make the mystery deeper, not shallower, because they define the boundaries of what we can understand, and the stories keep stepping just beyond them. The massacre was a brutal, bloody turning point. It represented the explosive peak of Prohibition-era gang violence, a moment where the underworld war spilled over in such a spectacular fashion that the entire nation could no longer look away. Before February 14, 1929, the public often viewed figures like Al Capone with a strange mixture of fear and fascination, seeing them as rebellious businessmen providing a forbidden service. After the photographs of those 7 bodies against the brick wall were published, that romantic illusion shattered completely. The clinical cruelty of the execution laid bare the true cost of the bootleg empire. It was no longer a game of cops and robbers, but a systemic disease of corruption and murder that threatened the very fabric of society. In this way, the massacre did not just kill 7 men, it killed the public's tolerance for the gangster era. The outrage it generated became the fuel for a renewed and relentless federal crusade, turning the full force of the government not just on Al Capone, but on the entire economic structure of organized crime. The era of the untouchable ganglord was ending, and the St Valentines Day Massacre was its violent final crescendo. It also stands as the ultimate symbol of Prohibition's catastrophic failure. The law, intended to promote morality and social order, had instead created a vacuum filled by unprecedented criminal enterprise and bloodshed. The garage on North Clark Street was a direct product of that failed policy, a place where illegal alcohol was stored and where the battle to control its profits was settled with machine guns. The massacre proved that the demand for alcohol could not be legislated away, only driven into the shadows where it festered into something far more dangerous. It became the exhibit for reformers arguing that the 18th Amendment had backfired spectacularly, accelerating the call for its repeal just a few years later. The ghosts of that garage, then, are not just spirits of murdered men, but ghosts of a profound national mistake. This gives the event a powerful dual legacy. On one hand, it is a meticulously documented historical crime. We have police reports, ballistics evidence, photographs, and volumes of investigative files. It is a case study in forensic limitations and the code of silence. On the other hand, it has become a cornerstone of American ghost lore, a story where the facts end and the whispers begin. This collision is what makes it endlessly fascinating. We are drawn to the solid ground of history, the names, dates, and Tommy gun models. Yet we are equally pulled toward the misty realm of the unexplained, the cold spots, and the phantom Cadillac. The massacre exists at the precise point where our rational need for evidence meets our deeper, almost primal need for narrative and meaning. When justice is absent and closure is denied, we build our own monument. For the St Valentines Day Massacre, those monuments are made not of stone but of story. The historical record tells us what happened. The ghost stories tell us how it felt and why it still matters. They are the emotional residue of the event, the way a community and a culture process a trauma that was both shockingly real and hauntingly unresolved. This is why we return to that empty parking lot, why we listen for echoes in the static, and why this single morning in Chicago continues to captivate us. It is not just a crime to be solved, but a mystery to be lived with, a permanent question mark on the map of American history. From the cold, hard facts of Tommy guns and tax evasion to the inexplicable chills in a nursing home parking lot, we have walked a line between two worlds. One is a world of ledgers and headlines, of Al Capone's calculated empire and the 7 lives it erased in 90 seconds. The other is a world of whispers and shadows, of phantom Cadillacs and the scent of cordite on a summer breeze. These are not separate stories, they are the same story told in 2 different languages. History speaks in dates and evidence, while memory speaks in echoes and unease. The massacre was a wound inflicted on Chicago's soul, a violent rupture that never fully closed. Some wounds never heal, and some stories never truly end. They simply change form, seeking new ways to be heard, so we are left with that final, haunting question. Are the ghosts of Clark Street a supernatural reality, spirits trapped by violence and a lack of justice? Or are they something just as powerful, the living echoes of a story we, as a culture, simply cannot forget? A tale of brutality and unfinished business so potent it has etched itself into the very atmosphere, waiting for anyone sensitive enough to listen. What do you believe? Have you ever felt the weight of history in a place, or heard a story from your own city that blurs the line between past and present? Share your thoughts on historical hauntings and Chicago lore in the comments below. I read everyone. If you want to join more journeys into history's deepest mysteries, be sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening. Until next time.